Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. We had been backpacking in the Sierra Mountains for 3 days when it happened. It was the kind of trip that starts out exciting and full of laughter, but slowly grinds you down. Heavy packs, sore feet, and the kind of silence at night that feels alive. There were 5 of us, me, my friend Dylan, his brother Mark, and 2 other guys we knew from college, Tyler and Ben. We'd started near a small trailhead just past Mammoth Lakes, and planned to make a big loop through the backcountry before heading back. The first few days were picture perfect. The sky was a deep, endless blue during the day, and at night the stars came out in such numbers it looked unreal. We hiked through pine forests that smelled like sap and dirt, crossed small creeks on shaky logs, and camped near a different lake every night. The air was thin, cold in the mornings, and so clean it almost stung your lungs. By the 3rd night we were camped near a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. There was a little stream not far off, trickling quietly in the dark. We'd found a decent spot about 30 yards from the water, far enough to be safe, close enough to refill bottles in the morning. We set up our tents in a loose circle around the campfire. Everyone was tired from the long hike that day, about 12 miles mostly uphill, so once the sun went down, nobody was in much of a talking mood. We cooked our dinner, simple stuff, dehydrated meals and oatmeal packets, and then cleaned up, making sure to follow the usual bear safety routine. In places like this, you don't mess around. Bears in the Sierra are smart, persistent, and used to humans. If they smell food, they'll come. Everyone knows that. So before bed, we always put everything with any kind of scent, food, trash, soap, even toothpaste, into the bear bag. Then we'd haul it up on a sturdy branch using a rope, and leave it hanging high enough that a bear couldn't reach it from the ground. That night, we went through the same motions. I double-checked my tent and pack, making sure nothing with a smell was inside. The fire burned low and the temperature dropped fast. Soon we crawled into our sleeping bags. The forest settled into that deep, muffled quiet where every tiny sound, a shifting branch, a breeze, the distant rush of water, feels huge. At some point in the night, I woke up. It was the kind of waking that comes from no dream, no noise, just a sudden feeling. My body was warm inside the sleeping bag, but my face was cold. I could see the shape of the tent above me, a faint silver outline from the moonlight. I glanced at my watch, 2:03 a.m. The forest outside was still, completely still. I shifted on my side, pulling the bag tighter around my shoulders, and then I heard it. A sound like heavy breathing, distant at first. Not human, slower, wetter, deeper. It came in short bursts like something sniffing. I froze. It was faint, but close enough that I could tell it wasn't just the wind. Then I heard a soft crunch of leaves. Something was moving around camp. For a few seconds I just listened. My heartbeat felt loud in my chest. Then another sound. A sudden thump followed by what I can only describe as a grunt. I propped myself up slightly, careful not to make noise. And that's when I heard it again, this time much closer. It was right outside someone's tent. Then came the yelling, a short panicked shout that cut through the silence like a blade. I recognized the voice, Dylan. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of fabric tearing. I unzipped my tent fast, the zipper sounding like thunder in that silence. Cold air rushed in, and I stuck my head out. What I saw made my stomach drop. Dylan's tent was shaking violently. I could see the shape of a massive black bear on top of it, the whole thing collapsing under its weight. The bear was huffing and growling, pawing at the tent like it was trying to dig something out. The moonlight caught the animal's fur, glossy and dark, its back muscles shifting as it moved. It was enormous, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen up close. Dylan was yelling inside, muffled and frantic, his sleeping bag twisting beneath the bear's paws. Everyone else was scrambling out of their tents at once. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my flashlight. I clicked it on and pointed it toward the chaos, but the bear didn't even flinch at the beam. It was focused completely on Dylan's tent. Mark was already shouting for us to grab something to make noise. He'd grabbed a pot from near the fire pit and was banging it against a rock. Tyler and Ben joined in, throwing small rocks toward the bear. The clanging echoed through the forest. I picked up a stick and smacked it against a metal cup, the sharp sound cutting through the night air. The bear hesitated. It lifted its head, sniffed the air, and made a low, deep growl that vibrated in my chest. Then it turned slightly, still half on the tent. Its snout pushed against the collapsed fabric, and I saw a flash of something white. The toothpaste tube. That's when it clicked. He must have forgotten it inside. We yelled louder, banging and throwing rocks, anything to scare it off. The bear finally pulled its head back, stood up on all fours, and for one awful moment just stared at us. Its eyes caught the flashlight beam, reflecting a dull amber light. Then it gave a loud huffing sound and started backing away. It turned toward the trees, pausing once more before loping off into the dark, its massive shape disappearing between the trunks. For a few seconds, none of us moved. The only sound was Dylan's tent creaking as he pushed his way out. He was pale, sweating, breathing hard, his sleeping bag torn open. The tent itself was shredded in places, one pole bent nearly in half. The toothpaste tube lay near the entrance, crushed and leaking. He was lucky, really lucky. The bear hadn't bitten him or clawed through to his body. It had only been after the scent. Still, he looked shaken beyond words. We didn't go back to sleep after that. We sat around what was left of the fire, adding wood to keep it bright. Every noise in the forest felt closer now. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the pines. We talked quietly, trying to calm down, but everyone's nerves were shot. Around 4 a.m., the forest started to lighten a little. The moon dropped behind the ridge, and the first faint hints of dawn showed through the trees. By then, we were just waiting for morning. When the sun finally came up, we packed everything fast. Nobody said it out loud, but we all felt the same. That heavy sense that we'd come close to something we couldn't control. When we took down Dylan's tent, we saw the full damage. There were deep claw marks through the fabric, one corner nearly ripped open. The ground around it was disturbed, with clear paw prints pressed into the dirt, big ones. I took a few photos, not really sure why. Maybe to remind myself later that it really happened. As we packed up, we found the toothpaste cap about 20 feet away, and the rest of the tube flattened in the dirt. The smell was strong enough to still sting your nose. We tied up the trash and carried it far from camp before heading out. The hike that morning was quiet. Nobody joked or talked much. Every rustle in the bushes made us turn our heads. It was strange. Before that night, I'd thought of bears as something exciting to maybe see from a distance, a highlight of a trip. Afterward, the idea of seeing one again made my stomach knot. We reached another campsite that evening, much lower in elevation and closer to a main trail. There were other groups there, people with bright tents and laughter, unaware of what had happened to us the night before. We set up our tents a little apart from them, and that time, everyone was double-checking the bear bag like it was a ritual. Dylan barely spoke that night. He just stared at the fire, silent, his face pale in the glow. The shredded fabric from his tent was folded neatly beside him, like a reminder. When I lay in my sleeping bag that night, I couldn't shake the sound of the bear's breathing, that slow, heavy rhythm, the way the air seemed to move with it. I kept seeing its eyes catching the light. I didn't sleep much. Every noise felt suspicious, every gust of wind like something stepping closer. By the time we got back to the car 2 days later, we were exhausted, not just from hiking, but from that quiet tension that never left after that night. It's strange how fast fear can wear you down. On the drive back, the mountains looked peaceful. Calm ridges, soft green valleys, sunlight cutting through thin clouds. But I couldn't look at them the same way. Somewhere up there, that bear was still wandering, maybe even passing near the spot where we'd camped. To it, that night had probably meant nothing. Just a smell worth following, a quick search, then gone. But to us, it had changed everything. When I think about it now, what stands out most isn't the bear's size or even the danger. It's how quiet everything became after it left. How the forest swallowed up the sound of our fear like it had never happened. We were small out there, completely at the mercy of whatever lived in those woods, and I think that's what stayed with me. That sudden understanding of how thin the line is between safety and danger in the wild, and how one simple mistake, one forgotten item, can be the thing that invites something much bigger into your life. Ever since that night, when I go backpacking, I check my bear bag twice, then I check it again. And when the wind moves through the trees in the middle of the night, I always find myself listening, just in case I hear that deep, heavy breathing again. I was 14 the first time I went that far into the woods alone. I'd been hiking around those trails since I was maybe 10, always curious about what was past the next ridge or over the next valley. My parents didn't really know how far I went most days. They just knew I liked being outdoors, and as long as I came back before dark, they didn't ask too many questions. The forest behind our house went on for miles, with old logging trails, half-collapsed bridges, and the kind of silence that only exists when you're too far from town to hear traffic. It was late summer. The days were still warm, but the evenings had that slight coolness that hinted at fall. I packed a small backpack with water, some crackers, and a flashlight that I almost never used since I always tried to be home before the sun dipped too low. I remember the way the air smelled that morning. Sharp pine mixed with damp earth, the kind that fills your nose and somehow makes everything feel cleaner. I didn't have a compass, just a habit of marking turns in my head by trees or rocks or broken signs. I figured I knew the forest well enough to find my way back by instinct. That day, I wanted to see how far the old logging trails went. They twisted deeper into the hills than I'd ever followed them before. The path started out wide, then narrowed as ferns and moss crept over the edges. Every so often I'd find rusted beer cans or a bit of wire sticking out from the soil, small reminders that people had been there once long ago. The further I went, the quieter it got. The sound of the highway disappeared entirely, replaced by the steady crunch of my boots and the distant call of crows. I didn't realize how far I'd gone until the trees started to change. Thicker trunks, darker bark, the kind that blocks most of the sunlight. The ground was covered in a soft layer of pine needles that muted every step. I must have been 2 or 3 miles out, maybe more. I stopped for water, leaning against a dead tree that was hollow inside, and that's when I noticed it. A smell. It was faint at first, like something sour carried on the wind. I thought it might have been a skunk or maybe something rotting in the undergrowth, but it grew stronger as I walked. Within a few minutes, it was so thick it made the back of my throat tighten. It didn't smell like anything natural. It was the kind of odor that sticks in your clothes, a mix of rot, iron, and something animal. The trail curved around a slope, and I saw a rocky outcrop ahead. The ground dropped sharply beyond it, almost like a natural cliff that had eroded over time. I walked closer, covering my mouth with my sleeve. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I had to know what it was, though. Curiosity pushed me forward. When I reached the edge, I looked down, and the sight nearly made me fall backward. At the bottom of the cliff was a pile, not just a few animals, but a heap of them. Deer, dozens of them. Some looked freshly killed, their coats still intact and red-stained. Others were bloated, torn open or half-buried under older carcasses. Their legs tangled together, antlers sticking out like twisted roots. Some of them were missing their heads. A few looked too small, the spotted fur of fawns mixed in with the rest. It didn't look like hunting. It looked like something organized, like someone had been dumping them here for a long time. The stench hit me full force. I had to cover my nose and step back to keep from gagging. Flies swarmed thick in the air, the low buzzing sound constant. Every part of my body screamed to leave, but I couldn't stop staring. There must have been 20 or 30 deer in that pit. I didn't hear the engines at first. The wind shifted, and then I caught it. a distant growl of four-wheelers somewhere behind me. It grew louder fast. My stomach dropped. Whoever had done this was coming back. Without thinking, I darted toward a thick patch of hemlock trees about 15 feet from the cliff edge. The branches hung low and close to the ground, perfect for hiding. I crouched under them, pushing myself into the shadow until I could barely see through the needles. The engines got closer until they stopped right behind the ridge. Two men rode in on four-wheelers, both in camouflage. They moved like people who'd done this 100 times. One of them hopped off and dragged two more deer from the back. Both limp, both still bleeding from bullet holes. They tossed them over the cliff like garbage bags, and I watched as they landed on top of the pile below, with a heavy, wet sound. The men didn't seem rushed. One leaned against his ATV, pulling something from his pocket. Smoke drifted up a few seconds later. Cigarettes. They talked while they smoked, their voices low and casual, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I didn't recognize either of them. I knew almost everyone in the area. There were maybe 20 houses scattered across 5 miles of back roads. But these two were strangers. They stayed there for 10 minutes or so. They laughed once, then got back on their ATVs and rode off, the sound of the engines fading into the woods until everything was quiet again. I didn't move for a long time. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my chest. Every snap of a twig or rustle of wind made me flinch. I kept expecting them to come back. When I finally crawled out from under the tree, I didn't even look back at the cliff. I just ran. I didn't take the trail home. I cut straight through the woods, moving as fast as I could, stumbling over roots and rocks. Branches tore at my shirt, and I scraped my knees more than once, but I didn't stop until I could see the clearing near our property. By the time I reached the edge of the field behind our house, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like rubber. When I told my parents what I saw, they didn't believe me. Not really. I got yelled at for going that far alone instead. They thought maybe I found a natural kill site or was exaggerating. I remember standing there trying to explain how many deer there were, how the smell was too strong to mistake for anything else, how I'd seen the men, but it didn't matter. All they heard was that I'd gone off miles away from home without telling anyone. I tried to let it go after that, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. For days I kept replaying the sound of the carcasses hitting the ground, the look of the tangled bodies, the flies crawling over everything. I started to feel paranoid walking anywhere near the woods. Every time I heard an engine in the distance, I'd freeze. A few days later, I told our neighbor. He was an older guy, quiet but friendly, always hunting or working on something in his garage. When I mentioned the dump, his expression changed instantly. He didn't say much, but I could tell he believed me. Later that week, he must have contacted the game warden because 2 trucks showed up at our road's end early one morning. They went into the woods for hours. That night, my parents told me they'd confirmed there was a dump site out there, a big one. The wardens had found the cliff and everything I'd described. They even brought back a few things as evidence, but no one ever found out who was doing it. The men never got caught. For months after, I'd see game wardens driving up and down the back roads or walking the tree lines with flashlights at dusk. They were probably hoping whoever was dumping the deer would come back, but nothing happened. Even years later, I never forgot where that place was. I didn't go back, but I could always picture it perfectly. The rocky ledge, the bend in the trail, the way the forest went dead silent around that area. Whenever I walked near that side of the woods, the smell would come back to me, faint and phantom-like, even if it wasn't really there. I'm older now, but that memory never faded. It wasn't just the horror of seeing so much death in one place. It was realizing how close I came to being found by those men. I was 15 feet away, hidden only by a few branches while they stood there smoking and talking. If one of them had looked even slightly to the side, I don't know what would have happened. I still hike sometimes, but I don't wander the way I used to. I don't take turns just to see where they lead. I stay on the marked trails, and I always carry a compass now. I never forgot what it felt like to stand on that cliff and see what humans are capable of doing quietly, deep in the woods where no one else ever looks. It was barely dawn when I started the hike, the kind of early morning where the air still feels heavy with dew, and the light hasn't quite figured out whether it wants to be night or day. The trailhead was quiet, the parking lot empty except for my rental car and a few damp leaves clinging to the hood. I could hear distant waves crashing somewhere below the cliffs, the soft rush of water mixing with the rustle of palm fronds overhead. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and I felt that strange, calm isolation that comes right before the world wakes up. I strapped on my small day pack, adjusted the straps, and started up the path. My headlamp cut a narrow beam through the gray morning mist, illuminating the slick red clay beneath my boots. The scent of wet soil and plumeria flowers drifted around me. Every so often I could hear the chatter of early birds hidden in the canopy above. The air was warm but still cool enough that I could feel the dampness settle into my shirt. About 20 minutes into the hike, my stomach began to twist. It started as a dull pressure, the kind you ignore at first, thinking it'll go away. I slowed my pace, pressing my palm against my abdomen, hoping to buy myself more time. But the feeling only grew more urgent with each step. It wasn't a maybe situation, it was a now situation. I stopped in the middle of the trail, exhaling through my teeth, scanning the dark path ahead. There wasn't a soul around, just me, the trees, and the steady hum of insects. My headlamp flicked across the undergrowth, catching bits of movement. Tiny frogs leaping out of sight, something rustling in the ferns. I thought about trying to find a spot off trail, but the ground was too thick with roots, and honestly, I didn't trust what might be lurking in that dense greenery. I remembered passing a small construction area near the trailhead earlier, where they'd been working on a new restroom facility. Maybe they had a porta potty set up there. I turned around, my pace quickening. Every step made my stomach churn harder. By the time I reached the clearing near the start of the trail, I was practically jogging. And then I saw it. A faded blue porta potty sitting a few yards from a pile of gravel, its door slightly ajar, the word Aloha Waste Management printed across the front. It wasn't ideal, but at that moment it was the most beautiful sight I could imagine. I yanked the door open, stepped inside, and immediately shut it behind me. The smell hit me first, chemical disinfectant mixed with something much less pleasant, but I was past the point of caring. The interior was dark, the faint early light filtering through the plastic walls in a dull green tint. I clicked off my headlamp to conserve the battery and did what I needed to do. It was quiet in there, except for the occasional creak of the porta potty when I shifted my weight. The air was humid and thick, and I could feel sweat forming along the back of my neck. Once I was done, I reached for my headlamp again to find the toilet paper. That's when everything went wrong. The beam of light cut through the dimness, and in the upper right corner, just above the little vent slats, something glistened. At first, my brain didn't register what I was looking at. It was just a shape, round and golden in the light. Then it moved, my heart dropped. Hanging there no more than 2 feet from my face was a spider the size of my palm, maybe larger. Its long, spindly legs stretched out like thin strands of wire, the body thick and striped in yellow and black. A Hawaiian banana spider. I'd seen pictures of them before, but in person they looked unreal, like something you'd see in a jungle documentary. This one was easily 5 inches across, and it was perfectly still, facing me as if it had been watching the whole time. My pulse quickened. I froze, my hand halfway to the toilet paper dispenser. The spider didn't move. I figured if I stayed calm and quiet, it would stay where it was. I just needed a few sheets of toilet paper and then I'd be out. Slowly, I turned the roll. The sound of the paper scraping against the plastic felt deafening in the small space. That's when the light hit its eyes. In that second, the spider exploded into motion. It scuttled across the wall with a speed that didn't seem possible, legs scraping against the plastic like dry leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I jerked backward instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were too close and my legs were still tangled in my underwear. The spider spun in tight circles on the wall, as if confused by the light, then dropped downward, right toward me. I flinched, twisting to the side, trying to get my legs out of the way. My knee hit the door hard, making the whole porta-potty shake. I cursed under my breath, my heart thudding so loud it drowned out everything else. Then it disappeared. I couldn't see it anymore. The light bounced off the walls, the floor, the seat, but the spider was gone. I glanced down and that's when I saw it. Between my knees, tangled in the fabric of my lowered underwear, the spider clung to the cotton, its legs spread out, twitching slightly as it tried to regain its balance. A bolt of panic shot through me. I froze again, afraid to move, afraid to make it worse. I could feel sweat rolling down my back, my mouth gone completely dry. I needed to get it off me, but I couldn't risk swatting at it. Not that close to where it was, I started wiggling my legs, small movements at first, hoping it would take the hint and crawl away. It didn't. The thing stayed right there, gripping tighter as the fabric shifted. I shook harder, my thighs trembling, the porta-potty creaking with every movement. Still nothing. Then it started climbing. I felt the faintest touch against my skin, like a feather brushing up my inner thigh. My brain barely processed it before the sensation turned into something sharp, deliberate. The spider was crawling up. I couldn't see it, but I could feel each leg's step, light but distinct, moving higher. My whole body tensed, every muscle tightening. My breathing turned into short gasps. That was it. I lost all composure. I exploded out of that porta-potty, bursting through the door with both hands, the plastic slamming against the side of the unit so hard it echoed through the clearing. I stumbled into the dirt, sunlight just beginning to cut through the trees. My pants were still around my ankles, and I nearly tripped trying to pull them up as I screamed. A raw, panicked sound that didn't even sound human. I clawed at my legs, slapping at my thighs, my hips, shaking the waistband of my underwear like I was trying to put out a fire. I didn't care who heard me. There was no one around anyway. I danced in circles, half-hunched, smacking at my clothes until I finally bolted several yards away from the porta-potty and just stood there, chest heaving, staring back at it. My heart felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my ribcage. I scanned my body, patting myself down, pulling at the waistband, lifting the hem of my shirt, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The spider was gone. I spun in a slow circle, scanning the ground. No movement there either. I had no idea where it went. The porta-potty door swung lazily in the breeze, creaking each time it hit the side. I could see the faint beam of my headlamp still glowing inside, tilted on the floor. The sight of that blue box made my skin crawl. I didn't dare go near it again. I stood there for a long time, just catching my breath. The jungle around me slowly came back to life. The hum of insects, the distant sound of waves, the rustle of palm leaves. Everything normal again, except for me. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely retie my waistband. My skin itched all over, phantom sensations of crawling legs that wouldn't go away no matter how much I brushed at them. Eventually, I pulled myself together enough to grab my pack and head toward the trailhead. I didn't even bother turning off the headlamp still lying in the porta-potty. I just wanted distance. As I walked back to the car, the sunlight finally broke through the clouds, golden and warm, painting the trees with a soft glow. You'd think it would have been calming, but I couldn't stop glancing down at my legs, half expecting to see that yellow and black nightmare clinging to me again. By the time I reached the car, my breathing had steadied, but my nerves hadn't. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, staring at the trail sign, trying to process what had just happened. It was absurd, ridiculous, terrifying. And as much as I wanted to laugh about it, I couldn't shake the image of that spider. Those long legs, that sudden movement, the way it vanished. I never saw it again. I don't know if it crawled out of the porta-potty and disappeared into the brush, or if it found some hidden spot in the folds of my clothes and dropped off later when I wasn't looking. All I know is that when I finally looked at myself in the car mirror, sweat still glistening on my face, I didn't see the calm, early morning hiker I'd been an hour earlier. I saw someone who'd just fought for his life against something tiny, fast, and far too close for comfort. I didn't go back to that trail again. The next day I hiked somewhere else, somewhere with proper bathrooms. And every time I stepped into a restroom after that, no matter where I was, I checked every single corner before doing anything. I never wanted to feel that crawling sensation again. Not ever. And yet, even now, sometimes when I'm alone and I catch the faintest brush of fabric against my leg, my body tenses up before my brain can tell it to relax. Because somewhere deep down, I still half expect that spider to come running out again, fast, unseen, and way too close for comfort. I'd been hiking in Alaska for a couple of weeks by that point, moving from one trail to the next, camping wherever I could find a flat patch of ground and a place to hang food safely. I'd grown used to the quiet there, the kind of quiet that isn't really silent but layered with the constant rush of water, the distant crack of branches, and the soft whine of wind brushing through spruce trees. It felt like being in a world stripped down to its original form, where everything was raw and clean and honest. I remember one particular morning near a creek north of Anchorage, where the salmon were running thick. The water was so full of flashing red that it looked alive, like the entire stream had a pulse. That was when I saw her, a grizzly sow and her cub about 50 yards away. The cub was maybe half her height, but already built like a small tank. The mother had her head down, focused completely on the salmon thrashing in the current. She'd dip her head, come up dripping, sometimes with a fish in her jaws, sometimes not. I stood there frozen, watching her in this rhythmic motion that was almost peaceful. She wasn't looking at me at all, just moving along the bank, her cub mimicking her clumsy movements. I could hear her breathing even from that distance, a deep, heavy sound that mixed with the splash of water. My heart was racing, but I wasn't actually scared. I don't know why. Maybe it was because she was calm, and that calm carried over to me. She was too busy surviving to care about me. I took a few pictures, my hands trembling slightly as I zoomed in. The light hit her fur just right, showing the thickness and the pale tips where the sun bleached it. The cub stumbled once and shook itself off, spraying water in a little arc that sparkled in the air. After a few minutes, I backed away slowly, step by step, making sure I didn't snap a branch or move too fast. My boot sank softly into the wet moss. When I finally couldn't see them anymore, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. That encounter stayed with me, not for the fear, but because it felt like I'd witnessed something ancient, something that didn't care whether I existed or not. But the moment that actually scared me came later. A few days after, near Homer. It was early evening, the kind where the sky is still light but the shadows start stretching long, and the temperature drops fast. The air there always smelled faintly of salt and wet soil. I'd parked at the small lot by a trailhead that wound through patches of birch and open meadows. The path itself looked more like a paved bike route than a wild trail. Smooth, well-traveled, lined with low shrubs and wildflowers just starting to dry out from summer. Felt safe, almost suburban. I remember thinking that as I started walking, that it was a place where people probably brought their dogs or kids for short walks. About 20 minutes in, I could already see the glint of my car through the trees. That's when I heard a soft snapping sound, like a branch giving under weight. Then another. I stopped. The noise came from the left side of the trail, where the trees thinned out into taller brush. Before I could even process what I was hearing, a massive shape stepped out from the trees. A moose. She was enormous, taller than any animal I'd ever seen up close. Her fur was a dull brown, long and shaggy around the shoulders, with her dark snout moving slightly as she breathed. For a moment it was just her. Then a smaller figure appeared behind her, wobbling a little. A calf, still lanky and uncertain on its legs. My stomach dropped. I'd read enough to know that a mother moose is unpredictable and dangerous, especially with a calf around. She was directly between me and my car, maybe 30 yards ahead. The air felt heavy suddenly, the way it does before a storm, except it wasn't weather. It was me realizing I had nowhere to go. The trees behind me were thick, the ground sloping down sharply toward a boggy patch I couldn't run through. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe properly. The mother moose lifted her head and stared straight at me. Her eyes were dark and expressionless, but they locked onto mine in a way that felt deeply personal, like she was trying to decide what I was. For a moment, I thought she would just keep walking across the trail, but instead she stopped. She turned slightly, angling her body toward me, and began pulling at the tall green shrubs on the side of the path. Each bite was slow and deliberate. She would tear off a mouthful of leaves, chew, and all the while, her head stayed angled in my direction. The calf mimicked her movements, tugging at smaller shoots, but it was clear that both of them were fully aware I was there. The silence between those sounds was unbearable. The air buzzed faintly with mosquitoes. I could hear the faint ticking of my camera strap bumping against my chest with each heartbeat. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to do something, but I knew any sudden shift could trigger her. She could close that distance in seconds, and there would be no stopping her. Her shoulders looked like they were built from muscle and bone meant to break trees in half. I stayed still, feeling sweat starting to form under my jacket despite the chill. Time stretched weirdly. My knees began to ache from standing in one locked position, and my back started to twitch from the tension. I remember looking at the edge of her fur where the sunlight caught it, seeing dust motes floating lazily in the light around her legs. It felt surreal that something so beautiful could also mean danger. I tried to breathe as quietly as possible through my nose, shallow and controlled. Every inhale sounded deafening in my head. She kept staring. Occasionally, she'd flick her ears or twitch her skin where a fly landed. But that gaze, it never broke. It was like being measured by something ancient, something that didn't think in terms of fear or mercy. I started counting my breaths to stay calm. 10 breaths, 20, 30, I lost track after that. My arms felt like stone. My feet were cramping. Still, I didn't move. At some point, I don't even know how long it had been, she shifted her weight, gave a low, huffing breath, and stepped forward. The sound of her hooves against the asphalt was deep and heavy. The calf followed, brushing against her side. They moved so slowly that I didn't realize right away that they were heading off the trail again. I stood there, frozen, until the last bit of her flank disappeared behind the birch trees. Only then did I exhale. My chest felt tight, my body trembling slightly. I looked down and realized I had my camera in my hand. I hadn't even raised it. I didn't want to. Taking a picture would have felt wrong, like inviting something that could turn on me in an instant. When I finally started walking again, it was in slow, careful steps, even though I knew she was gone. The world felt too quiet, too still, as if everything around me had been holding its breath with me. I could hear the crunch of gravel under my boots, the faint rustle of leaves high above, and my own heart still thudding in my ears. The car came into full view after a minute or two, the metallic reflection in the low sun looking unreal, like it belonged to another world. When I reached it, I opened the door and just stood there, one hand on the handle, looking back down the trail. There was no sign of them, just the empty path curving out of sight between the trees. I remember the smell of the interior, faintly dusty, warm from the sun, and the sound of my pack sliding onto the seat. My hands were still shaking. I sat down, started the engine, but didn't drive for a while. I just sat there listening to the idle hum, trying to process the fact that I'd been within spitting distance of an animal that could have flattened me in seconds. That night, back at my campsite, I couldn't shake the image of her eyes. They were calm, but sharp, like she'd seen hundreds of people freeze in front of her before and knew exactly what they'd do. I realized that I hadn't been afraid of the bear by the creek because the bear had ignored me. I was irrelevant to her, but with the moose I mattered. I was something she had to assess, and that thin line between curiosity and aggression was something I could never predict. Even now, whenever I think back on Alaska, it's not the wide landscapes or the glaciers or the salmon that stand out most vividly. It's that stretch of trail outside Homer, The faint hum of mosquitoes, the stillness in the air, and the massive shape of that moose blocking my way home. It taught me something I didn't understand until later. That real fear doesn't always come from the wild things we expect. Sometimes it comes from being reminded in the quietest and simplest way that out there, we are not in charge. We never were. It was the late 90s, and I was in my junior year of high school, caught somewhere between trying to act like an adult and still being just a kid who didn't really know what life was yet. That afternoon had the kind of dry heat Arizona is known for. Clear skies, the sun already starting to tilt westward, but still sharp enough to sting the skin. My best friend and I had planned a hike up Usery Mountain with two girls we liked. It was supposed to be one of those casual, almost romantic hangouts where nothing was said out loud, but everything was quietly hoped for. Usery Mountain was familiar territory to us. East Mesa had always been this mix of desert wilderness and growing suburbia, where open land met cul-de-sacs and saguaros stood taller than some of the houses. I'd been hiking there since I was a kid with my dad, but back then, I never paid much attention to the details. As teenagers, we went for the thrill of it. The height, the view, the feeling of being above the town for a while. We started the climb around mid-afternoon. The air shimmered slightly from the heat, and the dust on the trail clung to our shoes. Liz and Sarah, the two girls with us, were joking most of the way up, their voices echoing faintly off the rocks. My friend Ryan was walking ahead, wearing his favorite baseball cap backward, a half-empty Gatorade bottle dangling from one hand. The Wind Cave was our usual destination. Everyone from Mesa knew about it. A big, shallow cave carved out of the rock face near the top of the mountain, with a view that stretched all the way across the valley. You could see the desert spread out below like an ocean of tan and gold, with little spots of green where houses and golf courses had started creeping in. We reached the Wind Cave, just as the shadows were starting to stretch long across the desert. The air inside was cooler, carrying that faint mineral smell of dry stone. We rested for a while, drank what was left of our water, and looked out at the view. But after a few minutes, Ryan got that restless look he always did, the kind that meant he wasn't ready to head back down yet. He pointed further up the ridge, where the rocks narrowed and climbed toward the actual summit. It wasn't part of the official trail, but people did it sometimes. It wasn't exactly safe, but we were 17 and thought that made us untouchable. So we scrambled up behind him using hands and feet, our shoes sliding a little on loose gravel. When we finally reached the top, it felt like standing on the edge of the world. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the faint grid of mesa far below and the hazy blue outline of the Superstition Mountains in the distance. The wind was steady up there, strong enough to make our shirts ripple and our hair whip around. For a moment it felt perfect, just us, the sky, and that wild quiet you only get when you're high above everything else. Then Ryan noticed something. He was sitting on a flat rock, catching his breath when he leaned forward and said he'd found something weird. Lying there, half tucked between two small stones, was an old rusty Altoids tin. It looked like it had been there for a while. The paint faded, the edges rough with rust. He popped it open without thinking much of it, expecting maybe some leftover mints or a few coins. Instead, inside were two folded-up pieces of paper. They were yellowed and slightly brittle from the sun and heat. Ryan spread them out carefully on the rock. The first sheet was a pencil drawing. It was a crude sketch, but it was instantly recognizable. It showed the exact view we were looking at from that spot. Every major rock formation, the valley below, the faint line of the horizon. It was all there. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, it said, "The last view from Daniel's eyes. March 3rd, 1996. The name might not have been Daniel. I can't remember for sure anymore. But the date stood out to me. It was less than a year before. The second paper was an apology letter. It started with a short introduction, almost polite, and then it became a list. Line after line of names, each followed by a sentence or two of regret. Things like, "I'm sorry for what I said to you at the hospital," or "You didn't deserve the things I said," or "I should have been a better friend." There wasn't any mention of what they'd done, just this quiet kind of sorrow that seeped through the page. None of us said anything at first. The wind kept pushing against the papers, fluttering their edges. I remember pressing a rock down on one corner to keep them from blowing away. It didn't feel like we'd just found trash or some random hiker's notes. There was something final about it, something heavy. We all sort of looked at each other, not sure what to do. The air seemed different, still, but charged somehow, like the desert right before a storm. We didn't really have the words for it then, but we knew what we were thinking. It was a suicide note. The drawing, the tone, the date, it all fit. Ryan folded the papers back up and put them in the tin, but instead of putting it back, he slipped it into his backpack. I remember him looking out at the horizon again, as if trying to imagine the person who had been there last. When we started back down, none of us were really talking anymore. The silence felt awkward at first, then respectful. The desert seemed endless on the way down, every crunch of gravel underfoot echoing too loud. But curiosity got the better of us. When we reached the base, Ryan suggested we check the backside of the mountain. We thought maybe we'd find something. I don't know what we expected. A piece of clothing, maybe bones, a shoe. Anything that could connect the note to a real person. We spent the next few hours wandering through dry brush and rocky gullies, calling out occasionally, though we didn't even know what we were calling for. The sun was setting by then, the light turning orange and red across the mountains. Every shadow looked like it could be something. Every rustle of wind in the brush made my stomach tighten, but we found nothing. No signs of anyone, no remains, no belongings. Just miles of quiet desert and the sound of our own footsteps. When it got too dark to see, we finally headed home. The girls didn't say much after that, and the night ended quietly. I remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to picture the person who had drawn that view. What they must have been thinking sitting there. What would make someone walk all the way up a mountain just to leave their last words behind? In the days that followed, Ryan and I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was no internet search back then, not really. Not for things like that. So we decided to do some old-fashioned detective work. We went to the Central Mesa Library one weekend and dug through microfiche newspaper archives. The machine made that low humming sound as we scrolled through pages of old news articles, our fingers covered in that faint powdery residue from the film. We looked through every edition of the local papers from around that date. Missing persons, accidents, suicides, anything that might mention someone from the area who had disappeared around that time. But there was nothing. Not a single mention of anyone matching what we'd found. It was strange how empty that felt. We'd found something that seemed so personal, so final, yet there was no trace of the person behind it. It was like they had vanished from both the mountain and memory. Eventually, we stopped searching. Life moved on. We graduated, went to different schools, started different lives. Ryan moved away a few years later to somewhere up north. We lost touch after a while, as people do. Every so often, though, I'd think about that Altoids tin, about whether Ryan still had it somewhere in a drawer or a box, the rust spreading a little more each year. I used to imagine him one night, long after we'd grown up, deciding to open it again, unfolding those same yellowed pages, running his fingers over the handwriting, maybe trying again to find out who the person was. I still hike Usery now and then. It hasn't changed much, the same trails, the same view. But every time I reach that summit, I find myself looking around at the rocks, half expecting to see that little tin sitting there again, waiting for someone else to find it. I wonder if anyone else ever did. What unsettles me the most, even after all these years, isn't what we found, it's what we didn't. That person had stood in that exact spot, looked out at that same horizon, and decided to leave their final words behind. But it's as if the desert swallowed them whole, erasing every sign that they'd ever been there. And maybe that's the strangest part about living in a place like East Mesa. There's beauty everywhere, the sunsets, the open land, but there's also something quietly haunting about it. The kind of silence that holds too many untold stories. I've thought about writing them all down. The things I saw growing up. The strange cult-like groups that lived out there in the desert. The quiet tragedies no one ever talked about. Maybe someday I will. But for now, that little memory from the late 90s stays with me. As clear as the view from that mountain. The heat, the wind, the rusted tin. And that eerie sense of standing in the exact same place where someone once decided they couldn't go any further. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't supernatural. It was just something that happened. A real moment that left its mark and then disappeared. Like so many things do out there in the desert. But sometimes, especially when I'm hiking alone and the wind is moving through the rocks just right, I still catch myself looking down at the ground, half expecting to see another small, forgotten box waiting in the dust. I remember that trip so vividly, even though years have passed. Northern Ontario has a way of sticking in your mind. The smell of wet moss, the hum of mosquitoes, the endless silence between gusts of wind that makes you feel small. My partner and I had planned the hike for months, tracing old mining roads on topographic maps, trying to find remote lakes that almost no one visits anymore. The idea of seeing a place that hadn't been touched in decades, maybe longer, was too tempting to ignore. We parked near what used to be an access road for a mine that had shut down long before I was born. The road was little more than two faint ruts in the dirt, half swallowed by grasses and new growth. The sign that had once warned about blasting was faded to nothing. Just past it, a birch tree had fallen and fused itself into the trail like it had been lying there for a generation. It was early morning when we started. Mist still hanging low, the air cool and heavy with the smell of spruce. Each of us had around 27 pounds strapped to our backs. It doesn't sound like much, but the weight makes itself known quickly once you start moving through that terrain. Every 100 meters, a fallen trunk blocked the way. Some were massive, too big to go over easily, slick with moisture and soft with rot. Others had crumbled into jagged splinters, hiding rusty nails or broken glass from the mining days. We had to duck under some, climb over others, and at times detour completely off the road into dense brush just to make progress. The forest was thick. Boreal forest is different from the mixed woods down south. It feels alive in a more ancient way. The ground is soft with moss and layers of decomposed needles that swallow your boots. Everything smells faintly of resin and decay. The trees grow close together, thin and tall, each fighting for a little sunlight. Fallen trunks lie tangled everywhere like giant bones. When you look into the distance, you don't see depth, just a wall of greens and grays. After a couple of hours, we reached a point where the old road began to fade completely. The ruts turned into faint depressions filled with stagnant water, and the trees pressed in tighter. We checked the GPS and the old mining map we had printed at home. According to both, the lake we wanted was south of us, just over a small ridge. On Google Earth, it looked perfect. A round, still body of water with a small beach on its northern edge. We could see the pale sand clearly in the satellite image, like a tiny clearing carved out by nature herself. There was no visible path leading there, just solid green. We figured it wasn't far. Maybe a kilometer, maybe a bit more. That distance doesn't sound like much on a map, but through boreal forest it can feel endless. Still, we decided to go for it. It was early enough in the day, the weather was good, and we didn't want to turn back without at least seeing that lake. I took the lead. The air inside the forest was cooler and stiller, light barely filtered through the canopy. The floor was uneven, full of half-buried logs, exposed roots, and sudden dips. Every few steps my boot sank into soft ground. It was slow, deliberate work, picking each step carefully, trying not to get snagged on branches or twist an ankle. A few 100 meters in, I came across a tall conifer trunk, an old spruce, thick at the base with its lower branches long dead. The needles beneath it were brown and dry, a sharp contrast to the lush moss everywhere else. I stepped around it about 2 feet from the trunk, when my right foot suddenly vanished beneath me. It was such a strange feeling. No warning, no cracking sound, just gone. My leg dropped straight down into the ground. For a fraction of a second, my body didn't react. I didn't even feel fear at first, just surprise, confusion. Then the rest of me tensed up and I jerked backward instinctively. My knee slammed against the ground and I barely kept my balance. I pulled my leg out. The hole wasn't wide, maybe a foot across, but it looked deep. Far deeper than it had any right to be. The top layer was made of broken branches, compacted needles, and what looked like a thin crust of soil. It looked solid enough to walk on until you stepped on it. When I looked down into the opening, I couldn't see the bottom. It just disappeared into darkness. Curiosity got the better of me. I found a stick nearby, half a rotting branch, and started poking around. The stick went down easily with barely any resistance. I pushed deeper, then deeper still, until the branch was almost fully in. It felt bottomless. I pulled it out and the tip was damp, smelling faintly of rot. I realized it wasn't just one hole. Around the base of the tree, the ground looked suspicious. Soft spots, slight depressions, strange mounds covered with needles. That was when the thought hit me. How many more of these were out here? I took a few steps back, scanning the ground around me. Once I noticed the pattern, I saw them everywhere. Little sags in the forest floor near every other conifer trunk. Places where the soil looked slightly sunken or discolored. Some of them were tiny, no bigger than a rabbit hole. Others were larger, hidden under debris. I thought about how easily I could have broken a leg, or worse, if my whole leg had gone in. We started keeping our distance from any tree that had a thick base or exposed roots. It made progress slower, more cautious. The forest felt different now. What had been peaceful before now seemed unstable, deceptive, like the ground itself couldn't be trusted. Every step was a guess, and every rustle or crunch beneath our boots made us pause. At one point, I stopped and tried to understand what these holes could be. Old mining ventilation shafts, maybe? But they seemed too small for that. Maybe the roots of the trees had rotted out over time, leaving voids beneath them. Or perhaps old animal dens that had collapsed, expanded by years of freeze and thaw. Whatever the cause, they were dangerous. The deeper we went, the more the terrain changed. The trees became younger, thinner, and spaced farther apart. Patches of sunlight started to break through. The ground began to slope downward gently. I could smell water before I saw it. That clean, sharp scent of lake air mixed with mud and wet pine. Then through the trees, the forest opened up, and there it was. The lake looked exactly like it had on the satellite image. Clear, calm, a mirror reflecting the sky. The sand along the northern edge was pale and soft, scattered with driftwood and smooth stones. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing but the wind rippling the surface and the sound of a distant loon. We dropped our packs near the tree line and just stood there for a while, taking it in. The exhaustion from the hike hit me all at once. My shoulders throbbed from the straps of my pack, and my thighs felt like they were burning. But it was worth it. The silence of that place was something I've never felt anywhere else. Not empty silence, but a full one, like the forest was holding its breath. We stayed there for hours, ate lunch, filtered some water, and walked barefoot along the beach. The sand was cold underfoot, the lake even colder when I dipped my hand in. I remember watching the reflection of the trees on the surface and thinking how untouched everything felt. No litter, no old campfire rings, no signs of humans. It was beautiful in a raw, isolated way that you don't find often anymore. When we finally packed up to head back, I felt a little uneasy, not scared exactly, just aware of how far from civilization we really were. If something went wrong out here, it would be hours before anyone could reach us, maybe longer. We were miles from the nearest main road, with no cell service and only a rough idea of direction. Even the mining road we'd started on wasn't really a road anymore. The way back was slower. The holes near the conifers seemed even more numerous now that I knew what to look for. At one point, the ground gave a hollow sound under my boot, even though I didn't break through. It made my stomach drop. We started spacing ourselves out more, walking single file, watching each other's feet like we were crossing thin ice. When we finally reached the overgrown road again, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. We still had several miles to cover before reaching the car, and the fatigue was setting in hard. My shoulders ached, my hands were scratched from pushing branches aside, and my legs were streaked with dirt and sap. By the time we reached the car, the sky was streaked with orange and purple. The relief I felt was overwhelming, not just from finishing the hike but from knowing we'd made it out safely. We were both quiet on the drive back, too tired to talk. That night, while lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about those holes. How deep they might go, how many there were, what could have happened if one of us had fallen fully in. A 27-pound pack can drag you down fast if you're stuck in a narrow space. There'd be no easy way out, no one to hear you yell. The forest would just swallow you, and the ground would close up again like nothing happened. We got lucky. That's what I kept thinking, just lucky. The next morning, I looked up more about old boreal forests and found that it's not uncommon for decayed root systems to create hidden voids beneath the surface, especially near spruce and fir. Over decades, the roots rot out completely, leaving pockets that collapse when disturbed. Still, knowing that didn't make it feel any less eerie. When I picture that spot now, the quiet, the isolation, the false ground around those trees, I can't help but think about how close we might have come to disaster without even realizing it. The forest gave nothing away, no warning, no sound, no clue that the earth beneath us was hollow. It was a great memory, yes. The lake, the solitude, the sense of adventure. But every time I think back, it's not the beauty of the place I remember most. It's that sudden moment when my foot disappeared, and the ground proved that, in that vast stretch of wilderness, safety was only an illusion. We were miles from the nearest person, deep in a forest full of hidden voids, and it would have taken nothing more than one bad step for the story to end differently. I still hike, but ever since that day I never walked too close to a conifer trunk again. Back in 2015, I went hiking in Arizona during a solo trip I had planned for months. I'd been hiking for years and done trails in the Alps and Carpathians, sometimes through terrains that were steep, icy, or riddled with switchbacks that tested your endurance. Compared to those, the Arizona trail I picked that day looked mild. It was a long stretch of desert scrub, scattered rocks, and distant red cliffs that glowed under the sinking sun. The heat had softened by late afternoon, and the air had that dry stillness that made every sound carry for miles. I started early that morning, parking near a dusty pullout that barely fit my rental car. There weren't many other vehicles around. A couple of them looked like they had been there for a while, faded, caked in dust, maybe belonging to people camping deeper in the area. I signed in at the small trail registry by the entrance and started walking, carrying my water, flashlight, and a few protein bars. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, a loop that cut through some narrow canyons and came back near the highway. I'd done trails twice as long in harsher conditions, so I didn't think twice about going alone. The first few hours were peaceful. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides, broken by dry washes and low hills of pale stone. I saw the occasional lizard dart between rocks, and once I spotted a hawk circling far above. The silence was something I'd come to appreciate over the years. There's a kind of calm in it, a reminder of how small you are in a place so old and still. The light began to shift around 5 in the evening, that golden time when shadows grow long, and the desert takes on deeper shades of orange and brown. I had roughly 2 more hours before sunset, and I figured I could finish the loop before dark if I kept a steady pace. But as I moved farther along, I realized how deserted this stretch had become. For at least an hour, I hadn't seen another person. No hikers, no distant figures, not even the sound of anyone else's footsteps echoing through the rocks. Just the wind, faint and dry, brushing against my clothes, and the occasional distant caw of a bird. The path here was narrower and seemed less traveled. Small stones covered parts of it, and the footprints I saw looked old and faint. It wasn't unnerving at first. I liked solitude. But as the light dimmed and the air grew cooler, there was a strange shift in how the silence felt. It went from peaceful to heavy. My footsteps seemed louder. The crunch of gravel under my boots echoed in a way that made me constantly turn my head, half expecting to see someone behind me. But each time there was only the same empty trail fading into shadow. Then I heard something. At first it was faint enough that I thought it was just the wind catching a certain way between the rocks. But as I stopped and listened, I realized it was a tune. Someone was whistling. It wasn't a song I recognized, just a slow, wandering melody that rose and fell in uneven notes. It came from ahead of me, down the trail somewhere beyond a small bend. My first thought was relief. Someone else was out there, maybe another hiker making their way back before dark. I remember feeling oddly reassured by that. After hours of silence, any sound of human presence felt grounding. I picked up my pace a little, eager to see them, the dry air carrying the sound clearly as I walked. As I got closer, the sound grew sharper. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The tune kept drifting between pauses, like whoever was doing it was lost in thought, or maybe just keeping themselves entertained. I rounded the bend and finally saw him. He was a few yards ahead, walking in the same direction as me. A man, maybe in his 30s or 40s, wearing a light gray t-shirt and dark pants. That immediately struck me as odd because by that time the air was cooling fast. In Arizona deserts, when the sun starts to dip, the temperature drops sharply, and most people wear long sleeves or at least bring a jacket. He didn't seem to have any pack with him either, just walking, slow and steady, head slightly down, whistling that same tune. I slowed a little as I approached, partly out of politeness and partly because something about his posture felt off. He wasn't swaying his arms like most people do naturally. They just hung loosely by his sides. When I got close enough to pass him, I turned slightly and gave a small nod, just a quick greeting. He stopped whistling for a moment and looked up. His face was completely blank, expressionless in a way that didn't look tired or annoyed, just empty. His eyes met mine briefly, but there was nothing behind them. Then, without a word, he dropped his gaze again and resumed walking. The same slow pace, the same tune, picking up exactly where it had stopped. Something in that moment made the air feel heavier. It wasn't that he'd done anything threatening. He just seemed detached from the world around him. Like his body was there, but his mind wasn't. I kept walking, faster now, not wanting to be anywhere near him when the sun fully went down. After maybe a minute, I realized the whistling had stopped again. The sound had cut off abruptly, as if someone had flicked a switch. The silence that followed felt strange, too sudden, too total. I slowed my pace and glanced back, half expecting to see him a few yards behind. But there was nothing. The trail was completely empty. The light had dimmed enough that shadows stretched far along the rocks. But even in the fading glow, I could see down the path clearly. He was gone. Not farther back, not off to the side, just gone. The trail behind me curved only slightly, and there weren't any obvious places to step off without making noise. No large rocks, no bushes thick enough to hide behind. I stared for a while, waiting for the sound of footsteps or that faint whistle to start up again, but it never did. The air was still, completely still. That's when my body finally caught up with what my mind had been trying to tell me, that something wasn't right. I started walking again, faster this time. My heartbeat picked up, echoing in my chest with every step. The gravel crunched loud under my boots and every sound felt magnified. I kept glancing behind me every few seconds, convinced that if I turned around fast enough, I'd catch sight of him again. But there was nothing. The rest of the hike back felt like it took forever. The trail markers looked different in the darkening light, and I had to keep checking my GPS to make sure I was still on the right path. The desert had a way of twisting your sense of direction once the shadows lengthened. Every small dip looked the same. Every turn seemed to lead somewhere unfamiliar. I remember the exact sound of my own breathing as I climbed a small incline. The air dry in my throat, My flashlight gripped too tight in my hand even though I hadn't turned it on yet. The sun had almost disappeared by then, leaving behind a faint red glow on the horizon. I didn't hear any more whistling. No footsteps either. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept imagining the man's blank face, the way he hadn't reacted to me, the lifeless way he'd kept walking. The trail wound through stretches of scrub where the visibility dropped, and each time I entered one I felt like something was just out of sight, moving in rhythm with me but never close enough to see. By the time I reached the small wooden sign marking the end of the loop, the last light was fading. My car was the only one in the parking area now. The other dusty vehicles from the morning were gone. I remember checking my phone. It was just past 7. I got in the car, locked the doors immediately, and just sat there for a minute, staring at the trailhead in the rearview mirror. The path looked peaceful again, silent, unmoving. I drove back to town with the windows up and the radio low, my mind turning the whole thing over again and again. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe the man had taken a side trail I didn't notice. Maybe he'd stepped off somewhere to the right, and the terrain hid him. But even as I thought that, I knew how unlikely it was. The ground there was open, rocky, and sparse. Nowhere to disappear that quickly without making a sound. When I got back to my motel, I looked up the trail online, wondering if anyone had reported odd things happening there. I didn't find much. Just general hiking information, weather warnings, and a few comments about how deserted the area could get after dark. Nothing that explained what I'd seen. Over the next few days, I tried not to think about it. But every time I replayed that moment in my head, the way the man's eyes looked when they met mine, the abrupt silence after the whistling stopped, I felt the same uneasy weight in my chest. I'd encountered strange people while traveling before, but something about him was different. It wasn't danger I sensed from him, it was absence. Like he wasn't fully there. Sometimes I think about going back, maybe to see if I imagined it all. But every time I picture that stretch of trail, the lonely path, the fading light, the sound of that whistle drifting through the empty air, I feel the same quiet dread I did that evening. Whatever happened out there, I'll never know for sure. But one thing I do know is that for the rest of that trip, I never hiked alone again.